This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 9 of Here's How. On this show you'll hear about Greece, Grexit and what it means for Ireland, the problems of being an atheist in Ireland, and more about TTIP, ISDS and what they mean for Ireland.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Some unfortunate person tried to teach me metalwork a long time ago. I didn't learn much. But I do remember one thing I was told as I was trying to re-drill a hole that I had already drilled a couple of millimetres from where it should have been. As the drill bit kept slipping away from where I was trying to aim it, the teacher told me, "You can't drill half a hole." I remember that when I see a lot of how the system of justice works or doesn't work in Ireland. Nobody seems to have told the Gardaí or the other authorities that you can't enforce half a law. Park, the road safety lobby group, did a study on how penalty points are being applied to the licences of drivers who break the law. Very simply, they just sat in courts around the country and noted what happened when drivers before a judge, who are required to produce their licences, they watched what happened when those drivers didn't present their licences. The answer wasn't complicated. Nothing happened. Drivers who were cute to the system, more likely to be repeat offenders, simply show up without their licences, get convicted and pay their fine. And our system of justice is so incompetent, so lazy and so unfit for purpose that 80% of offenders convicted of motoring offences did not have their licence number recorded by the court clerk. Unbelievably, 96% of people who were disqualified from driving in court did not have their driving licence number recorded. This means that it's almost impossible to attach the appropriate points to licences or to enforce a driving disqualification. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that the people who are best able to pull this scam are the drivers with multiple convictions, the most dangerous, the ones whom it is most urgent to get off the roads. This abuse is so massive that there can be no doubt that people have died because dangerous drivers who should be disqualified are driving on our roads. But that isn't the only area where there is zero enforcement. The Moriarty Tribunal made its final report in March 2011, more than 4 years ago. It had already made an interim report in 2006, that's now nearly a decade ago. The final report found as fact that Michael Lowry, who's still an independent TD in Tipperary, Michael Lowry secured the ESAT Digiphone mobile licence, the 086 licence, for Dennis O'Brien, which made O'Brien a billionaire. It found that Lowry, who was the Minister for Communications at the time, gave information of significant value and assistance to O'Brien to win the licence. It found, as a matter of fact, that O'Brien had paid Lowry personally £500,000 and made other large donations to Fine Gael. It found, as a matter of fact, that Ben Dunn, of Dunn Stores and Ben Dunn Gyms, Ben Dunn had a corrupt business relationship with Lowry, and that Lowry had tried to influence Telecom Éireann, at the time a state-owned company, to pay an increased rent for a building owned by Ben Dunn. The High Court judge called this behaviour by Lowry profoundly corrupt. That report was more than 4 years ago. Since then, let alone anybody being charged or brought to court, the Gardaí have not yet so much as arrested or questioned anyone involved. They haven't even begun an investigation. Contrast that with the greatest Ponzi scheme ever. A fiendishly complicated scam was run by Bernie Madoff, swindling people out of billions of dollars in the United States. It was uncovered in December 2008. Within 3 months, Madoff was in jail awaiting trial. Within 6 months, he had been sentenced to 150 years in prison and had all his assets seized by the FBI. He's been doing time for the past 7 years, and there's no doubt he will die in prison. But findings of fact by a High Court judge in 2006, with more following in 2011, that serious crimes had been committed, still haven't aroused the interest of our Gardaí. In fact, the journal.ie recently reported that in the past 3 years, ministers have been giving the exact same answer every time they're asked a question as to why nothing is being done. Frances Fitzgerald, and before her Alan Chatter, gave this same answer. I am informed by the Garda authorities that, following the examination by An Garda Síochána of the report of the Moriarty Tribunal, the advice of the Director of Public Prosecutions was sought with a view to determining whether or not a full Garda investigation should be commenced. As this process is ongoing, it would not be appropriate for me to comment in further detail at this time. End quote. Get that, they're not waiting on advice on whether to proceed with a prosecution. They're waiting for advice on whether to begin an investigation. 4 years later, these Keystone cops can't work out whether it would be a good idea to start a criminal investigation or not. And that answer has been given at least 8 different times when answering questions from TDs, like Micheál Martin in May 2012 and again in June this year. Billy Kelleher got that answer in April 2014. Pierce Doherty got that answer 3 times in December 2012, in April 2013 and in June 2014. And Roisin Shortall got it again in May this year. That's not to say they got basically the same information. They actually got all exactly the same text. The department is just copying and pasting the same answer. So the Gardaí are refusing to do their job because they're waiting for 4 years for advice from the DPP, and the DPP clearly isn't in any hurry to give it to them. Exactly why they need the advice when they already have been told by a High Court judge as a matter of fact that these crimes took place, that's another question. And that's why your money will continue to be stolen. And that's why innocent people will continue to die on our roads. And that won't just happen in areas where enforcement is lax. Sloppy enforcement in one area undermines the ability to enforce the law in all other areas. So the next time you see a politician crying crocodile tears over someone ploughing a 4x4 into a family of his constituents, or complaining that there isn't enough money to go around for special needs teachers or for respite care for families of the disabled, remember this. You can't enforce half a law. If the rules of the road are only half enforced, they aren't enforced at all. And if white-collar crime is only half illegal, then it isn't illegal at all. We have to grow up as a society, and that means enforcing all the laws equally on all the people equally.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On a Skype line now, I have Dr. Julien Mercil from UCD. Julien, you've written recently about the Greek debt crisis. The Germans are saying that Greece must reform. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, Greece should reform like any other country, but it depends what kind of reforms we're talking about. So, for example, I would say that an important reform in Greece is to stop austerity, stop destruction of the social fabric, but that's not what Germany means. They mean the opposite. They mean you should reform, you should cut salaries, you should increase taxes, and you should weaken work conditions. So I don't agree with the reforms that are discussed in the media and by Germany, but in general, yeah, every country has reforms to do, let's say, to reduce corruption or collect the taxes, more taxes from the rich, or
Well,
things like that.
for example, a couple of years ago, it was being reported examples, for example, of a Greek hospital that had 40 gardeners but didn't have a garden. The example of people like DJs and hairdressers being allowed to retire on full pension when they were 50 years old because their jobs were deemed to be hazardous. Is that still happening? Has that changed?
You could always have more efficiencies here and there, like the examples you've just given. But it depends how you do that. I mean, do you do that very drastically in a massive austerity program that has crashed the economy, or you do it more in a more flexible fashion on the terms of the Greek people themselves? Because there are, of course, inequalities in Greece are very important, independently of the Troika and the bailout program. So there would be important reforms and progressive reforms to accomplish there anyway. But it's more on the terms on which you do that is important.
And the repayments that are being demanded by the end of June, do you think there is any plausible way that can happen?
If you push me and you are asking me where I would bet, and
I'm pushing, yeah.
Yeah, and if I'm a bit, if I don't really care about the actual events that will happen to confirm or not confirm what I'm going to say, I would say I have a very hard time imagining how they would not strike a deal, and how Greece, for example, would be pushed out of the EU and all that business. There's a guy called Mark Weisbrot. He wrote a good article about exactly this, and I kind of agree with what he says. Of course, it's a bit speculative, but I would be very surprised if the European establishment and the US would allow Greece to be independent in the sense of not being part of the European Union. You'd have an independent country right in Europe, led by a political party that's on the left, and could ally in one way or another with Russia or China.
Inside the tent is, I think, the euphemism. The reforms that have already happened in Greece, or perhaps not to say reforms, but the efforts to make repayments, I think, are probably greater than many people imagine. We discussed before the recording Carl Whelan's numbers. 25% of the public sector have lost their jobs. That's something that's very, very alien, where not a single permanently employed civil servant in Ireland lost their job. There's been a huge decrease in earnings in Greece. There's been huge tax increases as well. We did see that in Ireland. Is there any more blood in that stone?
No, well, as you said, the most important point is to realize that Greece has done so much already, that the most important part is that Greece shows that austerity doesn't work, or the reforms that we hear about don't work, because they've done so much more than anybody else, and they're doing pretty badly. So, like you said, 25%, a quarter of the public sector employment has just been gone like that. Just so you have 3/4 what you had 5 years ago. Public deficits have been reduced from like 15-16% of GDP to 2.5% today. So that's really drastic. And there's many other reforms, like you've said, that have been attempted, and it hasn't worked. And we knew that before, but I mean, now we have another confirmation that it doesn't work. So the way to deal with Greece is not to try to do more of that.
Sure. One startling fact that I did see the research on, and it was done by a BBC programme, more or less. They were challenged to substantiate the assertion that it would be cheaper to give every Greek train passenger a free taxi to wherever they were going, rather than actually give the level of subsidy to the Greek railways that they were getting. That actually turned out to be true. Isn't it true that even though we talk about public sector inefficiency in Ireland, in Greece it was just on an entirely different scale, and that there were heroic amounts of subsidies going to completely useless services?
Yeah, and again, it's what we were talking before. I mean, every country has inefficiencies. I mean,
but that's kind of a bland thing to say, Julian, that every country has inefficiencies. That's true. But there are enormous differences between the inefficiencies in some countries and those in others.
Yeah, I mean, some countries have more inefficiency than others, but the way to deal with that, if that's the goal, I mean, let's say Germany says it's the goal to deal with inefficiencies, progressives also, but there's a way to do that, which is not austerity, because now you're making it very, bad on the Greek people, and the economy is not recovering at all. So if you're interested in dealing with the inefficiencies, like you said, but then you have other ways of doing it, reducing inequalities, for example, or allocating better where work, in which sector are developed, or you were mentioning, what was your example about
DJs being allowed to retire at 50 because their job is deemed to be hazardous?
Yeah, well, I mean, problems like that, nobody would say, oh, that's a good thing, but it doesn't mean that you have to support austerity. You have to deal with those problems in other ways that mean other things than what we've heard about. So the problems are there. People don't deny them, but it's the way to deal with that. That would be the difference between a progressive view and the Troika view, for example.
Okay. In that case, I just want to move on to really the second question that I have, which is that within a very short time, one of two things will happen. Greece will either crash out of the Eurozone if a deal cannot be made, or a deal will be made, and that seems inevitably to include debt forgiveness for Greece. What are the consequences of those two options for Ireland?
I think the main scenario would be that, let's say, Syriza is able to stand up to the Troika and gets kind of a good deal. The threat of Greece for political leaders in Ireland and Europe is the example of Syriza showing a clear and progressive alternative to austerity. That's why they hate Syriza. That's why Enda Kenny doesn't like Syriza at all. If Syriza succeeds in any way, shape, or form, it sends a very powerful message to people across Europe, a bit like the Occupy Wall Street or the Arab Spring movement. It sends a message to people that it's possible to challenge the establishment.
So if Greece can fight and win, the question comes to Enda Kenny, why can't he fight too?
Yeah, exactly. Or why can't we have our own Syriza? Why is it, Syriza did this and that, they didn't fire as many people as Enda Kenny or whatever, they didn't cut as much, or they were able to fight back. So like you said, then it's harder to deny that it's possible for Enda Kenny or other people in the Troika. So that's the most important for me, and that's why parties like Podemos or Syriza are just really feared by anybody in the establishment. And if Greece is pushed out of the Eurozone, well then, of course, it depends what happens. If it's a disaster, well then the impact will be that it will discredit Syriza and Podemos. But if Greece is out of the Eurozone and is able to have its own currency, and then the economy eventually is recovering because they have more sovereignty over their own affairs, that again is a very threatening signal, because it shows to the Eurozone that countries that it's possible to be outside the Eurozone and have a good economy. But that again depends how it would go if they leave the Eurozone.
It depends on what will happen. But, and you're probably correct that if there's an example of a prosperous Greece outside the Eurozone, then that proves that that's possible. Greece could potentially turn into an Iceland, but isn't it more likely that Greece would turn into a Montenegro and just be a basket case?
Well, again, we don't know, but I mean,
do you think that the level of social involvement and the quality of democracy in Greece is sufficient to make it into an Iceland rather than a Montenegro?
My bet would be that if Greece leaves the Eurozone, things will be better. That would be my idea. And people like Paul Krugman, who's been right on many more things than mainstream economists so far, would say something similar. Dean Baker as well, Mark Weisbrot. Usually when there's a default like this and get your own currency, the first few months are very difficult and it can be chaotic. So that would be the problem, few months. But after that, it should recover. Now, the question is, are the first few months or year or whatever, the problems there, are they worth going through to get better recovery afterwards? That's a question that it's a bit difficult to discuss with certainty. But the only thing that is certain, if Greece remains with the Troika and the austerity, it's not going to go better. That's what we know.
Julien Merciel, Dr. Julien Merciel from the School of Geography, Planning and Environmental Policy at UCD. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
I'm joined on the line now by Matthew Wallace, who is a lecturer in strategic management at Nottingham Trent University. Matthew, you wrote a piece recently about TTIP. What on earth is TTIP?
Well, it's lots of acronyms. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is one word for it. There's lots of acronyms that are similar to this. For instance, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, is one of them. There are other ones called TISA. Basically, it's the acronym that is the moniker or the name for these discussions that are occurring right now between the US.
These are discussions that are intended to lead to a treaty.
To a free trade agreement, in kind of the traditional way that we understand it. So within European states, there are, trade agreements with regard to, free movement of labour in one respect, which is controversial, but also about regulations and also about taxes.
So why should people who are listening to this not be put into a coma, hearing about free trade agreements?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. The TTIP is not a traditional free trade agreement, really, because, between the EU and the US, and, these are Ireland's most important markets, the tariffs, the custom tariffs between that is only about 0.5% on average.
So that means if somebody manufactures something in Ireland, they can export it to the US with almost no extra taxes.
Exactly. It's a very low tariff already. So that's what is already in place. We have lived in this society for the last 20 or 30 years, a global society where globalization means the lowering of trade barriers, the increase of communication, such as you and I talking to each other for quite cheaply over the phone, the internet, etc. And one of those things are these free trade agreements have been going on for decades. In fact, Europe started them. This is a different type of trade agreement in that it looks at regulations. But within that is this other acronym called ISDS, or Investor State Dispute Settlement, which would create an extra legal case or an extra legal incident where individual corporations, usually multinational corporations that can afford it, can actually claim money or sue governments or states if they bring regulations in that harm their profit margins. And that's really the focus of this scandal. That's really the focus of people's attention for this TTIP and then this subpart, this clause of TTIP called ISDS.
And that sounds quite remarkable. For example, I know that there's a case with a similar type of investor-state dispute settlement forum whereby tobacco companies in Australia moved their headquarters to Hong Kong so that they could come under a treaty between Hong Kong and Australia which protected what they called IP, that's intellectual property rights, which in short just means the trademarks on tobacco brands. And then they said that Australian health measures curbing tobacco use were breaching this, and they threatened to sue the Australian government.
Well, they did, and it's still going in the courts. The Australian government won recently, just before Christmas, but Philip Morris, the company in question, is still pursuing this case. So Plain Packaging, which I believe, I'm not sure, is coming into Ireland soon, or is it?
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, so Plain Packaging is that's a new regulation that's come in. So with this ISDS settlement, whilst Philip Morris is suing the government of Australia and is suing, I believe, in Uruguay as well, that's quite public. These ISDS settlements would be closed courts. They'd be in camera. They would not be in public, and it would be an arbitration board of 3 nominated people. and we don't know who those people might be. For instance, do they come from the corporate world? Do they come from the political world? And then they would make a decision, and they would actually refund companies if regulations such as that imposed by Australia, if it damaged their IP, as you said earlier on, or if it harmed their profits in any way, which one would assume plain packaging and tobacco cigarettes would cause a damage to profits, then the taxpayer, the Australian taxpayer or government, would actually have to refund or reimburse Philip Morris for those lost funds if this type of ISDS thing went through.
This sounds extraordinary. Is there no limitation on this to allow public policy, to allow governments essentially to say that we as a sovereign government decide that this is the way the business should go in Australia, or coming up in Ireland if TTIP is endorsed? Is profit the only consideration?
This is more my territory now, I suppose. Actually, this is kind of the subject of my research. Really, there is a tension always between, the logic of profit, which is what drives corporate needs, and then what they say they do in order to keep their social license to operate. I guess what we need is kind of a serious and well-informed and balanced debate, rather than just looking at the Philip Morris case and remembering that TTIP and this ISDS, the investor state dispute settlement, is under discussion. Okay, so it's very good that we're having this conversation. It's very good that, the media in Ireland are reporting on this, the media in the UK and in Europe are reporting on this. So many governments have a lot of disquiet about this. The most powerful people in Europe currently, the Germans, also have a lot of disquiet about what this ISDS or what this TTIP would do to their public utility companies. In the UK, there's lots of concern about their prized possession of the NHS. And I'm not quite sure. I've been out of Ireland, unfortunately, for the last 6 years, so I'm not quite sure what I live in Nottingham, yeah. So the concerns in Ireland, I'm not as close to the button there, as it were. So it does sound incredible. It does happen, but we are talking about it now, and there needs to be this kind of a well-balanced and serious debate about it. I mean, TTIP would be a good thing if it manages to get regulations between the EU and the US. It would actually be beneficial to consumers, because possibly the price of cars will come down. Okay, but we also need to be realistic, and economists are famous for predicting the future and getting it wrong.
I just want to go back to you on that. What you're saying is the general idea of TTIP is to harmonise regulations so a car manufacturer wouldn't be faced with the cost of having a whole raft of European safety regulations that they have to comply with in Europe, and then a whole raft of other American regulations that are designed to have the same effect, but just happen to be drafted differently and require different engineering to comply with US laws.
Yeah. I mean, they would be the major beneficiaries of TTIP. I mean, that is the reason for this drive. That is the reason why the administration in the US and the EU Parliament are talking about this. Okay, and I think that is a good reason to discuss this, but we also need to discuss everything that comes with it. For instance, ISDS, but also, a lot of regulations in Europe, in individual countries, act as protectionism. Especially, Italy and Spain protect their traditional tobacco growing industries in the south of their country because it's so poor. So there are lots of regulations. It's quite complicated, but, losers might be certain people, in the EU, winners might be car manufacturers. Losers could be, say, people in the agricultural industries who find that their local regulations, EU regulations, or national regulations do not apply anymore. For instance, the UK, because of the mad cow disease in the past and BSE, finds it very difficult to export any sort of meat to the US.
Okay. Well, let me maybe take this back a little bit and say, for example, that we were having this discussion 100 years ago, after the Titanic had sank, and the British government brought in regulations that said there had to be a certain number of lifeboats on ocean liners. If TTIP and this investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, if that had existed at the time, could White Star Line and Cunard come along and say, we're suing the British government because it's costing us profits to have to put lifeboats on our cruise liners, and we want the money back from the British taxpayers?
That is a lovely analogy, William. I might rob that actually, if that's okay.
Yeah.
That is exactly what this would do. So that is what the proposal is for this ISDS. That is what the proposal is for TTIP with regard to these regulations, and that's what we need to have a well-balanced and serious argument about. TTIP might be a good thing, but would it be a good thing that a company could sue government or bring them to court because of safety regulations or because of labour regulations?
So, for example, Matthew, if you had perhaps regulations that were disguised as consumer protection, but in fact were protectionism. So, for example, in Italy and in some southern European countries, there are regulations that force you to use local products when international products are available and just as good. That's what the TTIP, those regulations are targeted at eliminating.
No, they're targeted at eliminating the type of regulations that mean duplication between the EU and the US. But as a side effect, as it were, or as, as one of the unintended consequences of this type of treaty going through would be exactly as you say, that some companies, instead of using the specific local product, might be able to, then the generic maker of these cheaper products might be able to sue local governments or national governments or even the EU because of those regulations, yes.
Matthew Wallace from Nottingham Trent University, thank you very much.
Thank you, William.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
John Hamill is a member of the National Committee of Atheist Ireland, which operates atheist.ie. He's on a Skype line with me now. John, why does Atheist Ireland exist?
Well, we really have two purposes, William. The first is to promote atheism in general, and the second is to campaign for ethical secularism. So in terms of...
Are you starting a new religion?
No, atheism is not a religion. Lots of people say atheism is a religion in the same way that bald is a hairstyle. So really what unites us is that we don't believe that God exists.
And why do you feel the need to come together as an organisation?
That's really the second part of the organisation, because sometimes for historic reasons and actually sometimes for relatively contemporary reasons. Lots of the laws in Ireland are explicitly religious and discriminate against non-religious people. So in terms of promoting atheism in general, we would take part in, for example, university debates on where does morality come from and is religion a good influence or a bad influence in the world. But then in terms of campaigning for ethical secularism, what we do is work with politicians, other NGOs, international bodies like the EU and the UN, in order to make sure that the laws in Ireland adhere to human rights, and they're based on rational and ethical positions rather than iron-age superstitions.
Sure. I'm seeing currently at the top of your website at atheist.ie that one of your campaigns is to get rid of the Angelus. It's, 60 seconds or 2 minutes of TV a day. Is it that high a priority for you?
Well, it's at the top of the website just because it's current. I think you're right in that if you look at the broad scope of campaigns that we're involved with, around, for example, the education system, the civil registration service, blasphemy laws, Angelus probably wouldn't be top of the list. Against that, RTE is currently working through a process to replace the Angelus, and what they've done is specified that the replacement that they will commission must include a number of elements of the Catholic call to prayer, including the 18 bells. So I think in general the idea of a pause for reflection, where we can all take a few moments out of hectic lives, is a good idea. but it's not necessary in Ireland of today that everyone who pauses reflection must do so according to the scriptures of the Roman Catholic Church.
I understand what you're saying, but there's a lot of variety on TV and radio these days. Isn't it better to achieve balance across the whole schedule and allow sometimes people to have their bells ringing for the Angelus and at some other time somebody to promote a different point of view rather than having everything homogenized into one kind of bland position that says nothing?
Rather than have the Angelus, the explicitly Roman Catholic view expressed on primetime television and radio every single day of the week, that maybe one day of the week could be set aside for non-religious pause for reflection. And you're possibly aware that Channel 4 and some other UK stations do something similar, where on a particular day of the week you might have some thoughts from an atheist perspective or other minority religions. But that's not what RTE is doing. What RTE is doing is issuing a commission, and the commission says that the 1 minute of broadcasting that will be provided at 6 o'clock every day will be exclusively Roman Catholic and will have no other faith positions represented.
Okay, well, moving on from the Angelus, what do you see as the major issues for yourselves as a campaign group?
Well, we see them really split into historic areas of the Constitution, where we think some areas of the Constitution are really out of date and don't reflect the Ireland of today. So that would include things like religious oaths for office holders like the President and judges, which are religious. So, for example, an atheist citizen of Ireland today may not be a judge and may not be the president of the country. So that's one area that would like to change. And also there are some other more contemporary areas of legislation which are also explicitly anti-secularist. So Taoiseach Joan Burton introduced the Civil Registration Act a few years ago, which discriminates against non-religious citizens. And of course, I think it's...
How is that the case?
So if you want to have your wedding solemnised, if you want to be a solemniser of weddings in Ireland, there are two sets of criteria to meet. If you are a religious solemniser, then the only criteria you have to meet is that you meet regularly for worship. If you're a secular solemniser, then there's a long list of criteria that you have to meet, including the organisation being established for a number of years, having more than 50 members. You must not campaign for a political cause. And when Joan Burton was asked in the Dáil why she has two separate rules, one for the religious and one for the non-religious, her response was that Ireland needs to protect marriage solemnisation from Elvis impersonators. So I think that raises two issues, really. The first is, if there's a couple in Ireland who would like to get married by an Elvis impersonator, I don't understand why Joan Burton feels it's her business to stop them. And secondly, if you look at what this means in relation to what Joan Burton feels is a reasonable wedding in Ireland, what she's saying is that if you get a man who puts on a silly hat and a fancy frock and he whispers some special words over a cup of wine to turn it into the blood of a 2,000-year-old Jewish carpenter, apparently that's entirely sensible. But as soon as that person wants to put on a white jumpsuit, apparently that becomes ridiculous and then it must be illegal. So this is the kind of silly situation that you arrive at when you try to make different laws for religious versus secular people.
I'll take that point. And just moving on, in terms of more everyday people who are not religious living their lives, you know, you can perhaps get around the marriage issue. People can get married in a registry office if they want to. That's one day of their lives, even if it's very important. But can you give me any examples of issues that crop up day in, day out?
Well, I think an example that most families in Ireland would be familiar with is the schools admissions. And there's a new schools admissions bill passing through the Oireachtas at the minute, and it will not address the area of religious discrimination. So in schools admissions in Ireland, and this is something that the UN and the EU has told Ireland many, many times, that it's a breach of human rights, but habitually schools in Ireland discriminate against children based on the religious affiliation of their parents. And I can give you
how exactly?
One example that we described for the Taoiseach. We met the Taoiseach earlier this year along with John O'Sullivan, the Minister for Education. But a secular parent applied to have his son join a primary school. It was in South County Dublin. And the principal replied to say there's 3 places left open at the school, and your son is very welcome to have one of these places, but only if he's baptised first. And you can maybe tell that story in reverse so that religious people can see how ridiculous it is. If you went to a school to have your son admitted and you were told that, well, yes, there's 3 places here and your son is very welcome to one of those places, but I see that he's been baptised. As long as you get him excommunicated first, you can have your son placed at the school. That would be entirely ridiculous. And of course, it's entirely ridiculous the way we have the system at the minute, where schools can demand baptismal certificates before taxpayers can allow their children to attend state-funded schools.
And to be clear, the principal making that demand is someone who gets his salary paid 100% out of taxpayer funds.
That's correct, and every single teacher in the school is paid out of taxpayer funds, and furthermore, in behaving in that way, the teacher was behaving entirely within the law. And the same thing is true throughout the education system. So in the rules for national schools at the minute, we have the infamous Rule 68, which says that religious education is the most important subject to be taught, and it must be integrated throughout the school day. So in the Constitution, you have a right as a parent to opt your children out of any area of the education system that disagrees with your philosophical convictions. So a secular parent in Ireland could tell the school that they don't want their child educated according to, for example, the Roman Catholic sacraments. I know lots of secular parents who really recoil at the idea that their children would be required to go and speak to a strange man dressed in black and tell him their sins. But if you want to opt your child out of that, whereas you have a constitutional right for that opt-out, Rule 68 means there's really no way to vindicate that right. I live in Castleblaney, County Monaghan, so for my 4 kids, I had the choice of Catholic School A or Catholic School B. There's no other option. And when my children go to school in the morning, they have a big cross on their chest from the badge of the school. They walk up a path to the school past a Marian shrine. They walk past a big statue of the Sacred Heart. Every classroom has a mostly naked man nailed to the wall with blood dripping out of him. And this is what we're told is inclusive of non-Catholics. And of course, it's not inclusive at all, because the entire education curriculum is just dripping with Catholicism.
Well, to put the iconography aside, what you're talking about, Rule 68, it essentially means that the religion class is the religion class, but when you have the English class, the English reader in the primary school features the children having their Holy Communion and confirmation. The Irish reader has the same thing, and each of the subjects are infused with the religion. And I understand that, but there's one other issue, is that primary schools typically have their religion class smack bang in the middle of the day, perhaps at noon, in order to make it as difficult as possible. For example, to have, if you had a religion class first thing in the morning, you could allow non-religious pupils to arrive late, or if it was last thing in the afternoon, they could leave early. But it makes it logistically impossible to have to do that when the class is in the middle of the day.
Yes, that's right, William. So I was helping my young fellow with his homework recently, and he had an English book, and his class were learning to spell OUR words. So they had to have a OUR word for where you tie up your boat, and that was harbour. And they had to have an OUR word for the person who is going to provide salvation or some such, and that was they had to write in my saviour. So they can't even learn how to spell without spelling in a Catholic way. And I think the point that you make around scheduling is also a valid one. So we were helping a parent recently in Dundalk, County Louth, who tried to opt their child out of religious education class. And the only thing the school could do was they wouldn't even tell the parent at what time the religion class would be. All they could do is phone them and say, well, in 5 minutes, religion class is going to start and you can come to school and pick up your child. Because they will not supervise children which are opted out of some classes. And I think a very telling comment was when the parent suggested, well, I'll just provide my child with a philosophy book or some such and they can read that book. And the comment from the principal was that we can't allow your child to do that because if your child does it, then everyone will want to do it. So they're explicitly admitting that there's a large demand for people to opt their children out of religious class, but the religious patrons just won't let them.
What is the main concern you would have outside the education system?
Well, one of the laws that we think doesn't get enough attention is actually the blasphemy law. And it doesn't get enough.
How many people have been convicted of blasphemy in Ireland?
That's exactly the problem. There have been not only have there been no convictions, but there have been no prosecutions under the most recent blasphemy law. But the impact.
Would you expect there ever would be?
No, but I don't think that's the main problem. The main problem is the chilling effect. So I was writing a piece for a local newspaper here in Ireland relating to the blasphemy law, and in describing the blasphemy law, what I said was, whereas a Christian citizen in Ireland can tell a secular citizen that Jesus is going to raise them from the dead and judge them from their sins and put them in hell for not believing in Jesus, the Son of God. If a secular citizen describes what they think of this doctrine, then they can be prosecuted for blasphemy. And specifically, I mentioned that the Christian religion believes that Jesus is going to return to the earth riding on a cloud while blowing a trumpet. And the sub-editor described how he would have to censor that piece of the text because he has some conservative readers who would complain. And the sub-editor said it really doesn't matter whether your case is correct or not. We don't have enough lawyers to litigate this. And similarly, in the marriage referendum campaign, I was part of a radio interview when the interviewer told me not to repeat on air what I had told him off air, which is the origin of some of the scriptural prohibitions on homosexuality. And I described that origin as coming from cave dwellers in the desert. And he said, that's offensive to Christians. You can't call the authors of the Bible cave dwellers in the desert. And I described the town where the caves were. It's in a place called Qumran in the desert near the West Bank. And again, even though that's entirely factually correct, that had to be censored from the radio interview because the local radio stations just don't have budget to litigate blasphemy cases.
John Hamill, member of the National Executive of Atheist Ireland, thank you very much.
Thanks, William.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
And that's almost the end of episode 9 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 30th of June 2015. References for everything I mention in the show are listed in a page for this episode on the here'show.ie website. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, please follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and of course subscribe to the show. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. And you can do all of that right from www.here'show.ie. Or you could just go out in the real world and meet people in the sunshine and tell them how great the podcast is. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.